Welcome to Chris Parkin Shooting Sports. Today, having a little look at airgun pellets. There are many choices in airgun pellets, but there's some critical things to factor in. Of course, number one of those is what calibre is the air rifle you're using. Is it a 177 or a 22, which are very common, or is it one of the less common 20, 25 or even 30 cal air rifles? Whichever it is, the same points are going to apply when you make your choice of air rifle pellet. Here you can see we've got quite a selection of various weights, prices and such and forth. Now I'll just move those out of the way first, because that is an exact example of an air rifle pellet I discovered very late with an air rifle of my own. This is a 177 pellet. It's a very heavy 10.34 grains. The GSB exact heavy Diablo. This has been superb in my own Varak pre-charged HW100. And the rifle always shot really well. For the number of years I had it, probably had it 5 years, and then one day I just found these pellets, tried them, and it just completely stepped the rifle up a notch, and I've used them ever since. And it just goes to show that sometimes, you know, if you go by what you've always had, you don't always necessarily pick up on and find out the best thing that's going to be the product that really makes something come to life in your hands. And yes, good as it was, it just got better. So that's always an example to me of when I got something a little bit, I won't say I got it wrong, but I certainly didn't get the opportunity I could have had from it. So I'll just move these out of the way to start with. Now you can see in front of me, we've got a selection of air rifles. We've got a Varak underlever spring piston air rifle. We've got the HW100 pre-charged at the back in 177, which, you know, that's 177, that's a 22, and this is the FX Impact Mark III in 22. Now, these two, as well as having a fundamentally different operating system, one being a spring piston, one being a pre-charge, they also have a fundamentally different barrel system in terms of that's got more conventional old-fashioned rifling in it. Old-fashioned pop's not the best word for it, but conventional rifling. Whereas the FX has got the smooth twist barrel. And I've found, generally speaking, that the preferences of pellets are a little bit different. The smooth twist is extremely accurate, but I think they're a little bit more pellet fussy. Which isn't to say they're going to perform badly with anything, but you can really find the sweet spot by trying different pellets with them. And when you've got the one you want, stick with it. Because one great thing about air rifle pellets is they are allowed, you know, you're allowed to buy them in quite large quantities, and there's no problem with having 500 in a tin, which will, you know, get you through probably a good week of shooting, even if you're super keen. So the factors to consider when looking at your air rifle pellet choice are, we've done calibre. The next thing might be the weight of the pellet. There's the shape of the pellet, and there's also the precise diameter of the pellet. Weight of the pellet might depend on whether you want a preference towards muzzle velocity or muzzle energy, retained energy or ballistics, the shape of the pellet and things like that. Now, to give you an extreme example, let's look first of all at this JSB Diablo. This is the Jumbo in 22, and that pellet is 15.89 grains. I think you can probably see it on the camera there. It's 15.89 grains, and it's a fairly conventional domed pellet, and the muzzle diameter is 5.5 millimeters. Now, it doesn't actually specify, but most pellets will actually be measurable and also will be consistent to actually a hundredth of a millimeter. So 5.5, so we've got 0.5 millimeter, and then you're going 0.51, 0.52, 0.53. And these are all factors that are well worth considering, because some barrels are slightly more critical or beneficial of finding that exact diameter. But if we compare those at 15.8 grains, or we could look at something completely different. This is an RWS Super Point. So we go from a domed pellet to a pointed pellet, or a Spitzer. And in fact, H&N call a similar pellet the Spitzkugel, which is kind of the German way of saying it's a pointed pellet. And we've got 16.05 grains on here, which is 1.04 grams. Now the FX pellets here also state 16 grains, which is 1.030 grams, but they actually go to a second decimal place on the pellet diameter. So these are 5.52 millimeters. This is a domed pellet suitable for plinking, target use or hunting. Some people might say that pointed pellets are more appropriate for hunting. I don't personally think there's actually a huge point to that, excuse the pun, in modern hunting culture. Other brands like the Magnums here, and this is a 5.5 millimeter again, but they don't state the second decimal place. But if you compare the shape of these with the previous ones, the dome is actually a slightly different profile. Let's go back to this JSB. And you can perhaps see there we've got a different shape. Now some pellets will suit barrels like others. I always say guns and ammunition are a bit like people. There are some you'll get along with and some you won't. There's nothing to say there's anything wrong with either, but there are just better matches made. Some of the more modern designs with a polymer tip in the actual hollow point of the pellet are quite easily damaged, so be careful when using these, and they tend to be longer too, so watch out for stability issues in the rifling twist rate. It's easy to see how the wasted design, like a wasp's waste on an air rifle pellet, will be detrimental towards smooth airflow in flight, but this is how it's been done for so long that it's only just recently that things like the airgun slug market has taken off with greater ballistic capability. Here we've got Air Arms Diablo Feel. That's another classic pellet in 2.2. Again, 16 grains, which is about the average for a 2.2 pellet. These are also the familiar domed profile. Some people might choose a wad cutter for shooting specifically small distances, short distances, for punching a more clean hole in the paper. Again, that's maybe something that's not quite as important these days because the actual consistency with which pellets are made are less critical towards the actual shape for making a precise hole. One thing to watch out for is that if a pellet gets too heavy and therefore too long, it might not actually stabilise in the twist rate of the barrel you're using. This is something very familiar to centerfire users, but a little bit less so to air rifle users. But air rifles like the FX, with lots of different barrel options, cater for this. And of course you'll notice differences between sort of sub 12 foot-pound air rifles and FAC air rifles because the velocities will be going up significantly. Generally speaking, regardless of caliber, I don't think it's wise to go beyond 1,000 feet per second with a lead pellet. So if you do need more muzzle energy, you generally go up in the caliber range, so you might go to 25 or 30 caliber pellets, with the appropriate barrel kit of course. These are in FAC specification rifles, so on sub 12, generally speaking on a 2.2, going much above a 16 grain isn't necessarily helpful. If you look at these Crossman Acupels here, they're actually very, very shiny. That's a slight factor of the alloy used and the finishing quality of the alloy used, and these are a very, very, very consistent pellet. And the Acupel for a long time was a great target use pellet. Because now we move on to slugs. Now slugs are a completely different factor because rather than being a wasted skirted pellet, the slug has a more parallel profile with a more conventional tangent ogive, a bit more similar to a conventional rimfire or centerfire rifle bullet in 2.2 caliber. They still have a concave rear to be pushed into the barrel by the probe, and the diameter can be critical to how well it grips your rifling. But if you look at these, we're looking at 22 grains now. That's for a standard 2.2 caliber pellet, but it's got a large hollow point shown there, giving you more expansion when it actually strikes the impacted object. As well as accuracy on paper, it's very important to assess how the terminal ballistics are if you are hunting with a pellet, what it performs like on the quarry. I can tell you for a factual difference that my 177 air rifles require very, very precise positioning for headshots on squirrels, whereas the 2.2 pellets from a standard 12 foot-pound air rifle are actually a little bit more forgiving if they don't get that precise impact point, because that larger weight of the pellet just creates a greater thump when it hits, rather than being the more piercing impact of the smaller pellet. Both do the job just as well, but I will say on my 177 I find I have to place pellets more precisely, whereas with the 2.2 and on pigeons as well, I do find the 2.2 a lot more forgiving. But you've got to compare that against, in those specific calibers, the difference in external ballistics and trajectory. When you're setting up and testing air rifle pellets, it's very important to eradicate all of the variables possible. Make sure you've got your rifle set up on soft supports and it's stable. So when you're looking through the crosshairs and through the scope, those crosshairs want to be aiming exactly where you were shooting after the pellet has hit the target, because if the rifle is jumping out of position, it's affecting your shooting style. Other factors to look out for are perhaps how the pellet itself interacts with magazine systems, and as well as the rotary indexing and things like that. Is the longer pellet going to interfere with the actual breech arrangement of the rifle? When you slide the magazine in, is it going to deform the tip of the pellet? Again, the pointed pellets tend to be slightly longer for the same weight, and a deformed point has long been known to give slightly detrimental impact position. So it's affecting you zero. Whereas the domed pellet, which generally speaking, in my experience, seems to be the preferential choice, has got less of an issue with that because it's slightly shorter and it's slightly more forgiving, both at the time of manufacture and in storage, sale, retail, transit, rolling around in your pockets and rattling around in its tin. It's good to see pellets that have the space in the top of the tin filled with a foam insert like that, because when the pellets do rock around in transit by hundreds of miles from where they're manufactured, they're less likely to be damaged in transit. Precision diameter down to 0.01 of a millimetre is crucially important when you want to get the absolute maximum accuracy, because that 0.51 or 0.52 or 0.53 might make a critical difference. Shooting pellets at different ranges from your stable shooting platform in practice will also help you assess and make good notes about your external ballistics, so that whether you're either aiming off or dialing off, you've got a much better idea of how to place a precision shot on target. You cannot practice too much with an air rifle. It's part of the enjoyment and the quiet silence of the sport, where you've just got no disturbance, no mess, no annoyance to neighbours or anything like that, as long as you've got safe backstops and correct targets in use. Always be wary of pellets that are impacting targets sideways, because if you go into, say, a cardboard backer and you see a pellet in that target sideways rather than making a clean hole through it, that means the pellets aren't stable in flight. You'll often associate things like this with very poor grouping, and it's important not to blame yourself if that is something that's happening. Learn to recognise when conditions like wind have disturbed a pellet's impact point, and don't blame the pellet necessarily itself. When you open a pack of pellets, take a sample of a few and look at them in detail and assess whether they've been damaged, how the skirts are, whether they look round, whether they've been bent in the points and things like that. Because the quality of manufacture and consistency is crucial to accuracy. Skirt damage is one of the most obvious factors to look out for, but actually when the skirt goes into the barrel and it's swaged into the rifling, or the probe itself pushes it in, that skirt can actually flare back out to the correct shape. So it's not something to get too worried about unless it is detrimental to performance, or you find yourself buying a packet of pellets with 100 of those of 500 pellets. If they're damaged, that's a poor consistency of manufacture. All of the pellets you can see here in this picture from the above camera have been great pellets in different rifles. They've all shot extremely well, and I've got more besides this. One of my favourites actually in the FX Crown is the heavier 18 grain version of this JSB Diablo. It's been the one that's given me the greatest consistency and the greatest performance, and although slightly slower through the chronograph, it's still giving me exactly 11.7 foot-pounds, so it's entirely legal. And for hunting requirements, it's been very consistent in terms of its impact damage to the animal in question and the clean, necessary, humane nature of the kill delivered by it. It works in the magazine system, it doesn't foul the breech, and it also doesn't leave lead residue rattling around in the silencer as it's being shaved off down the barrel. Some barrels do like quite a lot of leading, so you need to shoot quite a few pellets through them, and cleaning barrels, unless you've got them wet or full of muck, is not necessarily an advantageous thing, because they do tend to be self-cleaning once they've got to the point where the pores of the metal itself have absorbed as much of the lead shaved off the pellets as is going to stay in them. After which point they will pretty much self-regulate. So don't get too over-obsessed with cleaning unless you do have moisture or corrosion problems or dirt getting into the barrel. Of course, if you go out, it gets wet, or you get bad humidity problems when you come back in the house from a night hunting, make sure you clean the moisture out of the barrel, because moisture always leads to corrosion. Price is a factor. Different pellets cost different amounts of money. But although it can be easier to judge when you see a price ticket that says $5.99, $5.99, $12.99, well, look at the quantity of pellets actually within there. That $12.99 is for 500 pellets. That $5.99 is for 200 pellets. So actually, this is better value. You will often find that with the large tins like this. That again is 500 pellets, and that was £12 too. I've never found that the most expensive pellet is necessarily the best pellet. It's all about how that pellet and your gun collaborate with each other to give you the best performance on target with ballistics and terminal ballistic performance that meet your requirements for either hunting or target use. Here you can see a specific example of the JSB matched Diablo pellets in both the Jumbo and the Jumbo Heavy. Now looking on the scales, we can see that the 16 grain Jumbo weighs 16 grains. Just as it says on the box. Let's have a look at now the 18.13 grains, see how precise they look, and we have 18.1 grains shown on the electronic scales. It's interesting to measure the consistency in terms of weight of several pellets. Smaller scales aren't always ultra precise enough to give you the definition and resolution required. For example, this pellet comes in at 18.2 grams because it is averaging it out. If I was to take 5 or 10 pellets and weigh them all at once and divide by that value, that would give me a more precise factor. If you are weight sorting pellets for competition use, you do need very precise scales to give you the resolution required to differentiate that 0.1 of a grain difference critical to the overall standard of accuracy you require. So you can go into it as much as you like. It's all part of the joy and fun of air rifle shooting. Being able to weigh pellets, test different pellets is the joy of shooting, and you get to practice from different positions and use things which are going to suit your needs most accurately. External ballistics, making sure you can place your bullet precisely on target, are all the same with air rifles as they are with centerfire rifles. The scale differs massively in terms of bullet speed, ballistic coefficient and ranges involved, but the principles themselves are easier to learn with an air rifle. You can shoot as much as you like and you can investigate the difference in experimentation from different shooting positions. Practicing with an air rifle is brilliant for every kind of shooting, because I will often say to people, if you can shoot a spring piston air rifle well, it has perhaps the most complex recoil characteristics of any gun you're ever likely to use. So it's great training, great practice, and although it hasn't got that physical level of recoil, the actual pulse within it and the time with which the pellet leaves the barrel within that pulse is what makes the spring piston air rifle quite testing. So when you do shoot well with one, you can take that as a pat on the back because you've shot well to do it, and that all transfers to later if you ever want to shoot rimfire or centerfire, regardless of range and distance. Interestingly, the types of barrel do have a difference, because something like a smooth twist barrel is actually choked at the end, so the pellet has quite a good long run at speed before it actually hits the swaging point where the barrel grips the pellet and spins it to rotate and give you that rifling spin, which is what gives you the longer range stability over a simple round ball bearing or a musket ball from 300 years ago. Some standard rifle barrels are actually choked as well, and often you'll find a rifle barrel of maybe 20 years ago where there was a foresight fitted, where that foresight dovetail is actually tweaked in or machined into the end of the barrel. That itself is what creates the very slight choke at the tip of the barrel. But it's possible to have a completely parallel twist throughout the whole barrel so that the pellet has a conventional twist speed through the bore. The usual twist rate of an air rifle barrel, for say a 2.2, and it turns once every 16 inches. Access to a chronograph is fantastic, but it's not absolutely mandatory. But when shooting on target, don't assume that the pellet that strikes higher is necessarily going faster. Different pellets can have different resonant effects down the barrel, which slightly alters the point of impact. And it's also important to note that when you've actually finished testing your pellets and maybe measured the group sizes and found the one you're most happy with the accuracy and precision of, to re-zero your scope correctly and stick with it, because if you swap pellets at a future time, you'll have to remember to re-zero again. Generally speaking, the diameter of the head of the pellet is slightly narrower than the diameter of the skirt of the pellet. The head diameter needs to meet that of the lands of the rifling, whereas the skirt diameter needs to be swaged into the full depth of the grooves, which is why it is slightly larger. But it's more delicate and more easily swaged by the rifling itself to give you that full airtight seal within the rifling. It's especially important to accept that with FAC air rifles and generally broad-ranging velocity capability within the same barrel, you will need to experiment with pellets to get the best balance for the speed of the pellet within the bore. Well, I hope you've enjoyed watching. I hope this has simplified a few of the points about choosing an air rifle pellets, but the joy is, just go out there, shoot safely and enjoy testing and experimenting with your air rifle and your air rifle pellet choice. Please like, please subscribe, please comment. This will give us more idea of what reviews you want to see in the future. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.